Mary Boykin Miller Chestnut was a remarkable woman who helped our state in more ways than less. She wrote a diary which today provides as a great primary source about the Civil War. She was a nurse in the Civil War, and she fought for the rights of women across the Americas. So who is Mary Boykin Miller Chestnut?
Well, if you really must know, Mary was born on March 31st, 1823, in Statesburg, South Carolina. She was the oldest child, and her parents were plantation owners. Her father was a South Carolina senator when she was born, and was in the House of Representatives when she was a bun in the oven. Mary's father soon became governor of South Carolina, and they moved to Columbia in 1828. This caused Mary to get a quality education, which contributed to her writings.
Mary began her diary in the February of 1861. She wrote about the hazardous happenings around her during the Civil War. Her husband was a staff officer and aide to the General P.G.T. Beauregard and a commanding general of the South Carolina Reserves. She followed his unit around as a nurse. This gave her the inspiration to write about the war itself.
She wrote about her political opinions, the stories she heard, and her own personal experiences. She also wrote about her lack of power as a woman in the South and the grief of her friends and acquaintances that were passing. We are very grateful for her for writing about her experiences so that we may know more about the Civil War in our state's past.
As you may have found out, Chestnut served as a nurse during the Civil War. She and a few other women followed her husband's unit around, assisting those as needed.
Mary was very good at what she did, and the soldiers grew very fond of her kindness. Mary Chestnut helped our own South Carolinians survive throughout the tough times of the war.
Mary fought for women's rights through the tough times in the Civil War. Mary wrote about the soldiers, the events of the war, but she also wrote about the hardships of women during the war.
In one of her diary entries, she wrote, "You know what the Bible says about slavery and marriage. Poor women, poor slaves." This caused lots of controversy among her readers because she compared the women to slaves, and the women did not want to be thought of as equal with the slaves. Mary's readers were usually women because most of the men were fighting in the war. This allowed Mary to write more freely about the women's troubles.
Mary Chestnut was one of the first women to get her opinion of women's rights on paper. Mary's writings helped give men a better picture of all that women do. Mary Chestnut's views of women's rights helped in the sculpting of what we know it as today.
Some may say that because Mary fought for women's rights, she was bad for South Carolina. The men back in the day probably thought she was a disgrace because they thought women should not have rights. Even though that was just their opinion and they were wrong, the women agreed with Mary, and now we agree with her. So all is A-OK.
Mary Boykin Miller Chestnut was absolutely full of good. Without her diary, we wouldn't know as much as we do about the Civil War.
Also, we thank Mary for supporting women's rights. Mary's diary provided motivation for future women to stand up and protest their restricted rights. Mary Boykin Miller Chestnut holds a great chapter in the history of South Carolina.